You've heard the legends, the pioneers, the explorers, the empire builders. But what about the people underneath all that? The ones who did the digging, the hauling, and the bleeding. The ones who made history happen and got nothing for it. These are the worst jobs in history, where we pull back the romantic myths and look at what it really took to build the world. Today, gold miners. It was brutal, it was filthy, it was often deadly, and most of them didn't even make it big. In the heart of the 1800s, a whisper rolled across the continent, a whisper that turned into a roar. They called it a rush, a gold rush. But it was more than just a mad dash for treasure. It was a promise, a rumor, a shimmering thread of hope tangled in mud and dust, a chance for the broke and the bold to rewrite their destiny with the swing of a pickaxe. Tens of thousands left their homes, their farms, their families, risking everything for a dream buried deep beneath the earth. But what did they find when they got there? What was the real life of a gold miner like? Not the legend, the reality. The noise, the grime, the endless labor, the rare triumphs, and the bitter ends. In this video, we'll dig into the gritty truth, from the desperate lives they left behind to the back-breaking process of digging for gold, the boom towns built on dreams and whiskey, and the men, and sometimes women, who came seeking fortune, but often found something else entirely. This is not just a story of gold. It's the story of the gamble, the grit, and the ground it all came from. To understand why so many people abandoned their homes in search of gold, we have to understand what they were running from. Life in 19th century America was, in a word, hard. Most people weren't wealthy landowners or city elites. They were farmers, blacksmiths, seamstresses, mill workers. Ordinary people whose days were consumed by labor and whose nights offered little rest. There were no weekends, no vacations, no retirement. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And even if you did work, there was no guarantee you'd have enough. In the countryside, families survived on what they could grow. They depended on their livestock, their crops, and the weather. Each one as unpredictable as the next. A single bad season could mean hunger for the winter, and a sick animal could derail a year's worth of planning. Children weren't spared from the effort either. They worked the fields, fetched water, tended fires, and took on real responsibility from an early age. In cities, things weren't much better. Industrialization was beginning to take hold, but the jobs it created were grueling and often dangerous. Factories were cramped, hot, and loud. Coal dust filled the air, wages were low, hours were long, and injuries were common. There were no workers' protections, no unions to advocate for safety, and no government programs to help if you got hurt. For immigrants, the struggle was even steeper. Jobs were scarce, discrimination was rampant, and living conditions were often squalid. There was also little hope of climbing the economic ladder. For most people, the idea of rising above your station was just that, an idea. If you were born poor, odds were high that you'd stay that way. Land ownership was still a distant dream for many. Education wasn't universal. Banks were few and far between. And if you did manage to scrape together savings, a single illness or accident could wipe it all away. So when word spread that gold had been discovered out west, raw, unclaimed, and just waiting to be picked from rivers and hillsides, it didn't sound like fantasy. It sounded like salvation. Here was a chance to escape the grinding cycle of poverty, to carve out something new. For once, there was no need for family wealth, formal education, or even social standing. All you needed, they said, was a strong back, a sturdy shovel, and the will to chase your fortune. For the average American, exhausted, overworked, and out of options, the promise of gold wasn't just tempting, it was magnetic. They didn't know yet how difficult the journey would be. They didn't know how rare success actually was. All they knew was that staying where they were meant more of the same. And that was reason enough to go. In 1848, just outside of Coloma, California, a carpenter named James Marshall spotted something shimmering in the tail race of a sawmill he was helping build. It was small, yellow, and impossibly bright. Gold. He tried to keep it quiet, but that didn't last long. Within months, tens of thousands of people from across the country, and soon from across the world, were packing their bags, selling off their belongings, and heading west. They came by wagon, on foot, by horseback, and later by ship. They came from New York and Ohio, but also from China, Chile, and Australia. Most arrived with little more than a few tools, a pocketful of hope, and a burning belief that gold lay just beneath the surface. But finding gold was far more complicated than the stories made it seem. At first, many miners tried their luck with placer mining, a method that focused on loose gold that had washed down into rivers and creeks over time. This was the image most people associate with the gold rush, a man crouched at the edge of a stream, swirling a pan of icy water, watching for the telltale glint of gold dust settling in the grooves. The technique was simple but exhausting. A prospector would fill his pan with gravel from the riverbed and gently shake it in a circular motion underwater. Gold, being heavier than sand and dirt, would settle at the bottom while lighter material was washed away. If he was lucky, a few golden flakes would remain, sometimes a nugget, but more often, the pan came up empty. Those who wanted to process more material than a single pan could hold often built sluice boxes, long wooden troughs lined with ridges to trap heavier particles as water and gravel flowed through. A small team could shovel hundreds of pounds of dirt through a sluice in a day, increasing their odds, though not by much. Others tried the rocker box or cradle, a tool that resembled a baby's crib. It was operated by rocking it back and forth by hand while water was poured over a screen, washing gold and sediments onto slats. Again, it was more efficient than panning, but also more tiring. The deeper one dug, literally and figuratively, the harder the work became. As surface gold grew scarce, miners turned to hard rock mining, blasting into hillsides and splitting open quartz veins in search of gold hidden deep underground. This was dangerous, brutal work. It required pickaxes, hammers, chisels, and eventually dynamite. Shafts were dug into the earth, supported by timber frames that creaked under pressure. The air was damp and choking. Accidents were frequent. The noise never stopped. And through it all, there was the constant rhythm of digging, hauling, panning, and hoping. The tools of the trade were rudimentary: a shovel, a pan, a pickaxe, a tin plate to eat off of, and maybe a knife to scrape packed dirt from a crevice. There were no machines to rely on, no guarantees of results. Everything had to be carried, built, or bargained for. But perhaps more taxing than the labor itself was the waiting, the uncertainty. Imagine spending 10 hours bent over a freezing stream, fingers numb, back aching, only to walk away with a few flakes, worth less than the bread you bought that morning. And yet, People returned to the water the next day and the next, because every now and then, someone did strike it rich. And in those rare moments, the dream was kept alive, not just for the lucky miner, but all the others watching nearby. Prospecting wasn't just a job. It was a test of willpower, a physical trial wrapped in the hope of escape. The work was grueling, repetitive, and often soul-crushing, but the gold was real. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was within reach. Gold was never just a metal. It was a magnet. And wherever it showed up, people followed. From the Sierra Nevada mountains of California to the snowy reaches of Alaska, the gold rush reshaped the map of America. It carved roads into the wilderness, turned quiet streams into crowded camps, and gave birth to entire towns practically overnight. In Colorado, Montana, and the Black Hills of South Dakota, once empty valleys echoed with the clang of hammers and the roar of dynamite. But what sprang up around the miners wasn't civilization, not yet. What came first were the boom towns, and they were wild. These towns weren't built with any kind of plan. They grew like weeds, scattered across hillsides and riverbanks as words of a nearby strike spread. One day, there was nothing but trees, the next, tents. A week later, timber-framed saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and supply stores lined muddy main streets. The architecture was crude but functional. Buildings were slapped together with whatever lumber could be hauled in. Leaky roofs, slanted walls, floors made of dirt or hastily laid boards. Streets were often little more than churned-up mud, packed with wagons, mules, and miners moving through in a constant shuffle. Sanitation? Practically non-existent. Human waste and animal droppings mixed with spilled whiskey and rainwater. Disease was a constant companion. And yet, those towns thrived for a time. Everything in a boomtown revolved around gold, even if most people never touched it. Prospectors dug it up, but businessmen made the real profits. The men in the dirt found flecks. The men behind the counter took fortunes. For every miner who barely scraped by, a merchant grew rich selling him shovels, flour, or a warm place to sleep. The gold didn't trickle down, it was funneled up. Saloons sold overpriced drinks. Merchants charged a premium for tools, flour, boots, anything a miner might need or forget to bring. Laundry services were in high demand, so were blacksmiths, cooks, and entertainers. A few savvy individuals made fortunes without ever swinging a pickaxe. But for all their energy, boomtowns were also volatile. They could grow from a dozen tents to 1,000 residents in a matter of weeks, but just as quickly, they could vanish. When the gold dried up or shifted to another stream bed, people packed their bags and moved on. Whole towns were left behind, empty and echoing. And in the in-between, there was lawlessness. Local law enforcement, if it existed at all, was often overwhelmed. Murders, thefts, and barroom brawls were common. Many disputes were settled with fists or guns before they ever saw a courtroom. Gambling was rampant, so was drinking, and so was prostitution, often run from small rooms above saloons or in shacks on the edge of town. For women working these towns, whether voluntarily or not, life was no easier than it was for the men in the mines. Despite it all, there was something magnetic about these places. They pulsed with energy, with danger, with possibility. They were loud, dirty, chaotic, and unlike anything most miners had ever seen. Some came to strike it rich. Others came just to escape what they'd left behind. But once you stepped into a gold rush town, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a place. It was a gamble, built out of dust, whiskey, and dreams. The gold rush drew all kinds of people, but not in equal numbers, and not for the same reasons. By far, the majority of those who came west in search of gold were single men, many of them young, poor, and restless. Some were farmhands or factory workers looking to break free of a life that felt small and hopeless. Others were immigrants, Irish, German, Chinese, fleeing famine, war, or poverty in their home countries. The promise of gold offered something that had always been out of reach, a way to change your fate with your own two hands. These men often traveled light, a few tools, a blanket, maybe a pistol. They joined wagon trains when they could, or walked alongside the ruts of others' wheels if they couldn't afford a place. Many came alone. Few had a real plan. The journey itself could take months, whether overland by wagon across deserts and mountains, or by sea around Cape Horn, or through the malaria-soaked jungles of Panama. And once they arrived, there was no safety net, no home waiting, just the land, the dirt, and the dream. But not everyone who came west came alone. A smaller, but no less determined, number came as families, husbands, wives, children, grandparents. They packed wagons with flour, beans, salt pork, and cast-iron pans. They brought quilts, Bibles, and everything they needed to recreate a life in miniature once they arrived. Their journey was harder in some ways, slower, more vulnerable, more burdened by responsibility, but also more grounded. Where single men often drifted from camp to camp, families tended to settle, to stake claims, to build cabins, to plant roots. It was no easy life for either group. In the early days, most miners, regardless of who they came with, lived in tents or hastily built shacks. They were little more than canvas stretched over branches, or single-room shelters hammered together from whatever wood could be found. There was no insulation, no plumbing, no privacy. When the weather turned cold, people froze. When it rained, everything turned to mud. And when disease came, as it often did, it spread like wildfire. For the single man, daily life was grueling and repetitive. He might rise before dawn, cook beans over a fire, hike out to a claim, and spend the next 10 hours digging or panning. He'd return filthy, exhausted, and sore, perhaps with nothing to show for it. Bathing was rare. Laundry was expensive. Most slept in their clothes. Loneliness was common, though rarely spoken aloud. There was always the saloon for company, or the occasional letter from home, if it ever found its way through the mail. Families faced their own trials. Women often had to do double duty, cooking for the household, tending to children, and sometimes even helping with the mining itself. Children were exposed to harsh conditions early, frostbite in winter, dehydration in summer, and the constant risk of injury. But families, when they could hold together, created something rare on the frontier: stability. They built schools, churches, gardens. They helped towns evolve from chaos into community. In some camps, women were so scarce that their presence alone could reshape local economies. A woman who opened a boarding house, cooked meals, or offered laundry services could earn more in a week than many men did with a gold pan. In that way, women, especially those who traveled west with families, became the quiet backbone of many boomtowns. Still, whether you came alone or brought your kin, the West tested you. It asked what you were willing to endure in the name of hope. And every night, beneath the thin roof of a tent or the brittle walls of a shack, people dreamed of better days, even as the wind howled and the ground refused to give up its gold. For most miners, the days bled together. Muddy boots, empty pans, and the steady grind of disappointment. But every now and then, someone hit the motherlode. A strike could take many forms. Sometimes it was a few glittering flakes clinging to the bottom of a pan, just enough to keep a man from giving up. Other times, it was more dramatic. A buried nugget the size of a walnut, or a thick vein of quartz laced with gold deep inside a rock face. A real strike made a sound when it hit the bottom of a tin plate, a weighty metallic thunk that sent ripples of envy through every man within earshot. But here's the truth that rarely made the headlines. Striking it rich was rare, very rare. Historians estimate that during the California gold rush, only a small percentage of miners ever made substantial profits. For most, the gold they found barely covered the cost of their tools, food, and lodging, if that. A decent day might yield a few dollars worth of gold dust. A good week might cover your supply bill at the general store. And a rich claim? That was the stuff of rumor more often than fact. The legends, of course, tell a different story. There were men who stumbled onto riverbeds packed with gold, a few unearthed nuggets weighing several pounds. One infamous discovery, the Welcome Nugget from Australia's goldfields, weighed over 150 pounds. But these stories were outliers. The tall tales repeated around campfires, in saloons, and in newspapers desperate to sell more copies. And even when fortune did strike, it didn't last long. The cost of living in gold country was brutal. Prices soared with demand and distance. A shovel that cost $1 back east might go for $10 in the camps. A dozen eggs would cost more than a day's wage. A hot meal, a warm bath, or a dry pair of boots, all essentials, came with a premium price tag. And for many miners, money left their hands just as quickly as gold entered their pans. Then there was the temptation. Gambling, whiskey, women, games of chance. Saloon keepers knew how to separate a lucky miner from his money faster than the river could carry it downstream. Some men, flush with sudden wealth, blew everything in a matter of weeks. Others sent money home to families back east, hoping to buy land, build houses, or simply earn pride. But even then, gold was slippery. Banks were unstable, theft was common, and the very act of carrying your earnings through lawless territory could be a death sentence. Still, the possibility of striking gold, that fleeting, radiant moment, was powerful enough to keep men digging, even when the odds were against them. It was the dream that something more was just one shovel deeper, one river bend further, one sunrise away. For those who did strike it rich, life changed, at least for a while. For those who didn't, the dream was rarely abandoned. It simply grew quieter, buried under layers of dirt, debt, and perseverance. Because out west, gold wasn't just a mineral. It was a promise. And promises are hard to let go of. As the gold dried up and the rivers ran empty, so too did the hopes of thousands who had followed the call west. For most miners, the journey ended without riches. They returned eastward or wandered south or north, carrying little more than worn boots, aching backs, and calloused hands. Years of labor under the sun, months of eating beans beside a campfire, and 1,000 shovel loads of dirt, all for a glimmer that never came. Some didn't even make it that far. The goldfields were dangerous. Accidents in tunnels were common. Collapses, floods, poison gases. Disease spread easily in crowded camps where hygiene was an afterthought, and medical care was virtually non-existent. And then there was the violence, over claims, over cards, or simply over pride. Many men were buried near the very places they hoped would give them a new life. And yet, a surprising number stayed. When the gold stopped flowing, some miners became farmers, blacksmiths, or shopkeepers in the very boom towns they had helped build. Others found work with mining companies, trading their independence for a steady wage. Some settled down, married, and raised families, turning tents and shacks into homesteads. Ironically, those who did find lasting wealth were often not the miners at all. It was the merchants who sold tools and food, the saloon owners who ran the social centers of the town, the landowners who bought up claims and hired others to dig. The gold that was found was not in the ground, but in the men who chased it. There were success stories, yes, but they were the exception, not the rule. And even among the lucky, the costs were often steep. A fortune gained was sometimes a body ruined, and always someone else profited. For every back broken in the mines, a banker counted another deposit. The system was never built to reward the ones doing the digging. It was built to use them. A pile of gold dust couldn't mend a broken marriage or ease the loneliness that came from years spent alone in the wilderness. The emotional toll is harder to measure, but no less real. Many miners returned home disillusioned, poorer than when they left, but older, quieter, changed. Diaries and letters from the time speak of weariness, of dreams dulled by reality. Some never spoke much of their time out west again. Others recounted it with the wistful haze of nostalgia, half truth, half legend. However, even in failure, they became part of something bigger. Their stories became the bedrock of American myth. The rugged individualist, the adventurer, the man who bet it all on one great hope. Their struggles paved roads, sparked cities, and reshaped the land. And their voices, though weathered by time, still echo in the ghost towns and forgotten shafts carved into the hills. In the end, gold was never just about wealth. It was about possibility, about taking a risk, chasing a horizon, and writing your story into the dust. And for that, win or lose, the miners left behind more than gold. They left behind a legacy. Out there where the hills have settled and the wind carries only memory, the tools of the gold rush lie still, rusted, worn, forgotten. They no longer dig, they no longer pan, but they still speak, not in words, but in weight, in silence and story. We came chasing glitter. We came chasing change. The rush wasn't just for gold. It was for a different life, for a future unpromised but possible. And that longing, the hope behind it all, that was the real treasure. Because what is gold, really? A metal, a flash in a stream, a measure of luck. But hope burns longer. It calls men across mountains, over oceans, into the unknown. It breaks their backs and builds their legends. It builds empires too, though rarely for the ones holding the shovel. The gold rush made fortunes, yes, but not for the many who chased it. It was for the few who watched from balconies, who sold the tools, who bought the land after the rush. They reaped what others risked their lives to find. We remember the miners not because they found riches, but because they dared to look for them. And in the quiet that followed, they left behind more than abandoned shafts and empty dreams. They left questions we still ask. What would I risk everything for? What treasure would I chase, even knowing I may never find it? What story would I leave carved in the hills behind me? In the end, the gold rush was not just a moment in history. It was a mirror, and we are still standing before it. History loves to remember the men who wore the crowns, made the laws, and built the fortunes. But it forgets the ones who built the roads, dug the graves, laid the tracks, and risked everything for scraps. The story of labor is the story of the world. And most of the time, the people doing the work were the first to be forgotten.